If beauty is perfection, why does Rumi say that the light enters only through a broken heart? At first, this statement appears self-contradictory. In contemporary culture, beauty is equated with symmetry, control, and flawlessness. We polish, edit, and optimize everything, our faces, our careers, even our emotions, to appear complete. Brokenness, by contrast, is treated as defect or failure, something to be hidden or repaired. Rumi reverses this assumption. He argues that fracture, whether emotional, moral, or existential, is not the opposite of beauty but its doorway. A vessel that remains sealed cannot receive light. A heart that has never broken cannot deepen in awareness. When he writes, "Don't turn away. Keep your gaze on the bandaged place. That's where the light enters you," he is not describing sentiment. He is defining a law of transformation. This lecture will unpack that law through 4 rational steps. The modern denial of brokenness, Rumi's metaphysical code of transformation. Its psychological and neuroscientific parallels, and its modern applications for growth and meaning. Modern society defines worth through performance and image. From early education to corporate life, individuals are trained to conceal weakness and project competence. The implicit message is clear: to be valuable, one must be unbroken. Psychology provides evidence of the cost. Decades of research on perfectionism and emotional suppression show consistent associations with anxiety, burnout, and depression. Brené Brown's work on vulnerability highlights how fear of imperfection narrows emotional range and undermines connection. Similarly, studies by Frost and colleagues link perfectionistic standards with chronic self-criticism and diminished well-being. Underlying these behaviors is what can be called the wholeness illusion. It is the cognitive bias that assumes peace equals the absence of pain and beauty equals the absence of flaw. This illusion creates an impossible standard to remain intact in a world built on change. When life inevitably cracks us through failure, loss, or uncertainty, we interpret that rupture as personal failure rather than an essential mechanism of growth. Rumi's insight dismantles this logic. He reframes brokenness as information, not evidence of deficiency. The wound is not a verdict but a form of data, a message that something within the self-structure needs to evolve toward greater coherence. 2. Understand the depth of this idea. We turn to Jalal al-Din Rumi, a jurist, theologian, and mystic whose encounter with Shams Tabrik transformed his life. After the loss of Shams, Rumi's outward order collapsed, but from that collapse emerged an interior architecture of extraordinary insight. His writings, particularly in the Masnavi, are not mere poetry. They form a psychological map of transformation. Pain, for Rumi, is not punishment but purification. The heart breaks open not to destroy itself, but to make space for awareness. When he says, "The wound is the place where the light enters you," he offers not consolation but precision. The statement functions like a hypothesis about consciousness. Awareness expands in proportion to one's capacity to face fragmentation. From a rational perspective, Rumi's view aligns with findings in neuropsychology. Theories of post-traumatic growth demonstrate that individuals often report deeper meaning, stronger relationships, and heightened spirituality after adversity. Controlled stress, when integrated, promotes adaptability and neural flexibility, processes central to neuroplasticity. Rumi's mystical language thus encodes a scientific truth. Disruption is the precondition of evolution. Rumi's first principle is that breakage reveals what was hidden. It does not destroy what was real. When the mirror of identity cracks, reflection multiplies. You begin to see from new angles what was previously invisible. In psychological terms, crises expose subconscious structures. What collapses is not the self itself, but the egoic model, the internal narrative that filters experience. From a neuroscientific perspective, this logic parallels the brain's predictive coding framework. The mind constantly predicts reality based on past models. When predictions fail, when experience breaks expectation, the brain updates its map. In other words, learning depends on error. Similarly, spiritual learning depends on fracture. Don't grieve. Anything you lose comes round in another form. Here, loss is not pure subtraction but reconfiguration. The emptiness that follows a rupture is not absence, it is potential space. Freud's classic essay, Mourning and Melancholia, described mourning as a natural reorganization of identity after loss. Through the process of grief, energy once bound to the lost object is reinvested into new meanings. Neuroscience confirms a similar pattern. The brain forms new neural connections when existing pathways disintegrate. This capacity, known as neuroplasticity, requires intervals of instability. Growth is impossible without temporary vacancy. Rumi's insight anticipates this. What feels like emptiness is often the nervous system creating capacity for a new pattern of being. In Rumi's metaphors, the soul is like iron in a forge. Only through heat does it become malleable. Melt yourself down, he writes, and 100 forms will rise from your heart. The key distinction here is between pain and suffering. Pain is an inevitable biological signal. Suffering arises when we resist it. Rumi's invitation is not to glorify pain, but to use it as a process of refinement. In modern psychology, this principle corresponds to affect tolerance, the ability to remain present with uncomfortable emotions without repression. Studies on stress adaptation demonstrate that moderate, manageable stress enhances resilience and performance. This phenomenon, known as hormesis, describes how systems grow stronger through mild challenge. Rumi's forge metaphor thus expresses a measurable principle. Exposure to friction, when approached consciously, reorganizes both the psyche and the brain toward greater integration. In Rumi's metaphysics, perfection belongs only to the divine, which is unchanging. Creation, by contrast, is dynamic. Its beauty arises through contrast and impermanence. A cracked pot glows, not despite its imperfection, but because of it. Through the crack, both light and shadow are visible. Cognitive science mirrors this insight. Perception itself depends on contrast. The visual cortex identifies form through difference, not uniformity. A world without variation would be invisible. Similarly, a self without vulnerability would be unconscious of itself. For Rumi, imperfection is not a deviation from truth. It is the very condition that allows the real to be perceived. Rumi's vision culminates in a profound reversal. Wholeness is not the opposite of brokenness, but the awareness that contains it. From an epistemological standpoint, what we label breakdown is, from a higher vantage, a breakthrough in perception. When the self's prior models collapse, attention is freed to register deeper patterns of reality. The shattered self becomes capable of perceiving the constant beneath change. Ontologically, this view assumes that every form is transient, and that beauty lies in process, not permanence. Just as physics reveals that stability is a dynamic equilibrium of opposing forces, Rumi's philosophy shows that spiritual beauty is a balance between fracture and flow. Psychologically, his insight aligns with Carl Jung's concept of individuation. Integration occurs not by erasing the shadow, but by acknowledging and incorporating it. The psyche becomes whole when it ceases to exile its broken parts. Neuroscientific research adds a contemporary validation. Studies on self-referential processing show that experiences of ego dissolution, often during meditation or awe, correlate with greater neural integration and emotional clarity. Rumi's light entering the wound may thus describe a measurable cognitive shift. Expanded awareness emerging from the collapse of a rigid self-model. Rumi's teaching can be reframed as a practical framework for emotional and cognitive resilience. A disciplined approach to integrating disruption. Step 1. Acknowledge the crack. Recognize rupture without moralizing it. Naming the wound engages the prefrontal cortex, reducing limbic reactivity. Awareness begins regulation. Step 2. Stay present to the pain. Mindfulness-based emotional regulation encourages observing discomfort without suppression. Such awareness activates neural circuits of regulation rather than avoidance. Step 3. Reinterpret. Ask, what belief, attachment, or identity broke? Reframing transforms pain into feedback. Cognitive reappraisal shifts neural pathways from threat response to learning mode. Step 4. Integrate. Translate insight into behavior through journaling, therapy, dialogue, or contemplative practice. Integration closes the learning loop. Empirical studies reinforce these steps. Research on post-traumatic growth shows that roughly 70% of trauma survivors report increased appreciation of life and new personal strengths. Aesthetic neuroscience adds another dimension. Imperfections engage more emotional resonance than flawless symmetry, a pattern known in Japanese aesthetics as wabi-sabi. Rumi's version of this principle is direct. Do not hide the crack. Polish it with awareness. Beauty, in his framework, is not the absence of decay but the revelation of grace through it. Brokenness, then, is not an interruption of the spiritual path. It is the path itself. The wound is the curriculum through which consciousness learns its own depth. Rumi's lost code reveals that light does not seek unbroken glass, it seeks passage. What the rational mind calls loss, the awakened mind interprets as disclosure. The poet's metaphor carries a scientific precision. Systems, whether neural, ecological, or spiritual, evolve through disruption. Stability is not maintained by resisting fracture, but by integrating it. In this sense, Rumi's wisdom describes a cognitive model for growth. Fracture is feedback from reality, inviting the mind to reorganize itself toward greater coherence. The beauty you seek, he suggests, is not beyond the crack. It is the crack illuminated.